This year's winter was snowy and frosty. A blizzard raged for 2 days, generously covering everything with snow. Because of the severe frost and snowstorm, Dan was forced to stay indoors and sadly watched as snow flurries rose up, then scattered in different directions, covering everything around with snowflakes. But today, apparently, the blizzard decided to take a break, and finally, everything calmed down outside. It was a sunny day, and Dan was allowed to go for a walk. Dan was delighted. He decided to visit the animals and birds in the forest, and, together with his friend, the fluffy dog Red, went skiing into the forest, taking with him some tasty treats, carrots, nuts, and various seeds. Dan's dad was a gamekeeper, and sometimes took his son into the forest with him. And those were the best days. His father talked about the life of the forest and its inhabitants, and Dan listened with interest and remembered everything. But today, his father was away. Dan remembered perfectly well where his father had placed the animal feeders, and of course, he headed towards them. A joyful Red ran alongside, frolicking in the snow, sometimes burying his nose in a snowdrift and then tossing it up. He quickly became covered in snow, but that didn't stop him, and shaking the snow off, he frolicked again and again. Snow-covered fir trees stood majestically around. Snowflakes sparkled in the sun, shimmering with all the colors of the rainbow. It was quiet and fabulously beautiful. The silence of the forest was broken by the knocking of a woodpecker. Dan recognized it and, raising his head, saw a hard worker on the tree trunk, a woodpecker who was carefully examining the tree trunk and knocking on the wood with his beak. Having seen the boy, he flew up from the tree and obviously decided to see Dan off a little, flying after him. The tits were bustling about in the trees. They were fluttering from branch to branch, carefully examining them in search of some food. Dan sprinkled some seeds for the birds under the tree and rode on. There was a scurrying about among the spruce branches. It was a squirrel, emerging from its hollow in search of food after the snowstorm. Dan took nuts from his backpack and sprinkled them on the snow. He knew that the squirrel would quickly carry these nuts one by one to its hollow. The squirrel carefully descended to the ground. The sight of the nuts was enticing, and quickly grabbed a nut and just as quickly returned up the tree trunk. But it was necessary to go further. Among the trees and the snowdrifts, something stirred. 2 white little hares jumped out of the snowdrift with fright and ran away. Dan quickly took a carrot out of his backpack and put it on the snow. After driving a little further, he turned around and saw how the happy little hares were already near the carrots he had left for them and were happily eating them. Dan and Red were heading deeper into the forest, heading for the deer feeder their father had made. Winter was difficult for deer and roe deer, especially during severe frosts when a crust of ice covered the snow in the forest. They struggled to find food from under the snow, often injuring their feet on the ice and, unable to move, dying from exhaustion, hunger, and cold. Their father fed the animals, leaving hay, vegetables, and salt in the feeder, bringing it all in on the sleigh. The deer and roe deer knew the locations of these feeders and came to them. And finally, the wooden bird feeder appeared. Dan filled it with the hay his father had stashed away and added a few carrots. It was time to go home. After all, the winter days were very short, and Dan's grandmother was very strict. Dan returned home and the tireless Red ran alongside. Suddenly, he darted to the side and ran barking towards the fir trees. There, under a fir tree, lay a small fawn, covered in snow, motionless and completely unresponsive to the dog's barking. Dan rode up to the fawn, took off his skis, and ran up to it. Frozen blood was ran on its leg. The exhausted animal was barely breathing and was barely alive. Dan gently stroked the fawn, its closed eyes slightly opening. Dan left Red near the fawn and rushed headlong to the reindeer feeder. After all, that's where the sled his father had left it. Returning with the sled, Dan carefully picked up the little fawn and placed it on the sled. The animal was so exhausted from the cold and hunger that it offered no resistance. Dan folded up the skis, grabbed the back of the sled, and pulled the fawn home. And soon their house came into view. Grandma, seeing Dan through the window, came out onto the porch to greet them. She carried the fawn into the house and began fussing over it. She knew exactly what needed to be done, and Dan and Red just watched her. On the second day, the warmed and well-fed baby was back on his feet. Dan gave him carrots. At first, he refused to eat them, but then he liked them and ate them with pleasure. The fawn quickly settled into the house and wasn't afraid of anyone at all. The wound on his leg healed quickly, and soon the fawn was hopping around the house, but he slept in his designated spot, in the corner on a mat. So the days passed, and finally spring came. By this time, the little deer had grown antlers, and he himself had noticeably grown and become stronger. Every day he walked in the yard, and it was very noticeable that he really liked it. It was finally quite warm, and the trees were covered in leaves, and the grass was green. A fawn was walking in the yard. The gate was open, and Dan beckoned it to follow him through the open gate. The fawn timidly followed Dan. Very close to the house, the forest began with its familiar scents. They beckoned him, and he walked further and further. In the distance, at the edge of the forest, stood deer. They looked at the fawn with interest and received him kindly.